trying to catch up to you. Horses chasing, 'cause they're racing, so near yet so far, on a carousel.
The raw material of a potential smash hit. Route the sound through banks of electronic gadgetry and a nation's eardrums will be seduced. Music is being invaded by technology to help make symphonies out of smashing glass. But is this sound or music?
Just get in my way. Soon you leave and then I'll lose you. Still we're going round on the carousel. On the carousel. Run, 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 run with you. Up, down, up, down, up, down too.
Okay, fellas, let's do a take now.
The electronic sweat of a session with the Hollies. It took 5 hours of studio time to assemble the bits and pieces of their new record on a carousel for its assault on the world's hit parades.
Oh, okay, sure.
Riding along on a carousel, trying to catch up to you. Riding along on a carousel, will I catch up to you? Horses chasing, 'cause they're racing, so near yet so far.
The Hollies are riding profitably on the revolution that's transformed recording techniques. A few years ago, they'd have been recording on discs, a hit-or-miss studio session without time for technical refinements.
Still so far away, people fighting for their...
Now, the Hollies recording manager, Ron Richards, can graft 4 tracks onto the 1-inch tape on the studio recorder. Start with the rhythm section, add the vocals, then the guitar colouring, and finally, all tracks combined. A finely controlled layer cake, blended any way you want it.
The reason we do this is not to make sort of good artists out of bad artists. This we can't do. I mean, we can't make a singer sing in tune. If he sings out of tune, this we can't do anything about. What we're trying to do, and the reason we use 4-track tape, is trying to recreate on record, again, what the human ear normally hears. A microphone is not as good an instrument as the human ear. And if we didn't use this 4-track tape, as I say, we would get spillover from one mic. You'd pick up on one mic, the drums on a vocal mic. It would sound terrible. And the only reason we use all this equipment is to make it sound to the people when they listen to a record like they would hear it if they were in the studio themselves listening to it.
I can't stop you all night on a carousel, on a carousel. Run, 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 run with you. Up, down, up, down, up, down too. Riding along on a carousel, trying to catch up to you. Riding along on a carousel, will I catch up to you? Now we take our run together, no more chasing her. On a carousel, on a carousel, on a carousel.
Beatles recording manager George Martin is another manipulator of sound. He's encouraged the Beatles to experiment in some recent sessions.
Tape and electronics have brought an enormous new field to music. It's surprising what you can do once you have a sound recorded on tape. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can turn it round back to front, you can compress it, equalize it, add echo. There's a whole range of things you can do, which it would be obviously far too complicated to describe to you in detail. But take the sound of an ordinary cymbal, for example. Have a listen to this. Now, have you heard it backwards? With the speeding up of the voice, of course, we can get unreal effects. We can get, well, you all know records by the Chipmunks and Pinky and Perky.
Things like that. They're done by doubling the speed of the voice. Now, this puts the voice up an octave, exactly, in music. So that if you record...
People have always done slightly different things, you know. I'm sure that even the old composers, Bach and Mozart, were always up to new sounds, new tricks. They were always looking for new instruments. I think this is legitimate to explore new fields.
Tristram Carey successfully straddles the musical extremes, a trad composer in one mood and a leader in the electronic field when he tunes in his generators.
Quite a lot of my music is highly trad. I regard myself as a late developer. I haven't reached anything like my strength yet. But with electronic music, you're like the painter. You do the music, and when you've done your tape, that is it. Having selected a note, one can modify it in various ways by means of filters and that sort of thing. And usually you want to put some sort of a transient on a note, having got it, which means an attack. And so taking that note, for example, we could attack it in this way. That alters its quality as well, that form of attack. And let's take that first note, which is a very low note, and put an attack on that as well. It's possible to organize these sort of sounds into music which has a conventional, I mean, it sounds as if it was instrumental music and has bars and rhythms in the usual way. Music like this. This sort of thing isn't going to put instrumentalists out of work. The photographers didn't put the painters out of work. People tend to get overwhelmed by a sort of anti or pro thing and lose their sense of proportion. There's going to be room for every sort of music. For some reason, contemporary music appears to have got more out of touch with its public than the other arts. But this, again, you can't blame the composers for. You can't blame any artist for trying to break new ground. It's the natural habits of the man. And always, in every age, you've got a lot of fuddy-duddies who want to stop still. But I think it's a bit pointless for an electronic composer to spend his time imitating sounds which can, after all, be done instrumentally. Occasionally, one does it in the course of one's work. But the more interesting electronic work is to explore new avenues of sound which really couldn't be explored until the invention of the tape recorder. This was the key invention, because for the first time in the history of recording, you were able to chop sound up into little pieces. And this exploration has already produced quite a lot of music in the last 10 years. But I can play you a piece to illustrate this, which couldn't possibly be played on instruments.
I think that electronic music won't, in fact, be of great interest in the future. It seems to me that what is happening, that Europe is only just beginning to realize in music later than other things, because we were so advanced in music, that all over our one world, all sorts of cultures are penetrating one with another, especially in London, which really is, in that sense, the swinging city of the world.
Electronic music is, again, a most fascinating world where man can create any kind of sound, or nearly any kind of sound he wants to, and sounds which have perhaps never been heard before. But again, it must, even though great composers may exist who have the instinct to use those sounds in an expressive and consecutive way, it still is in need of a basic grammar. It's too wide a field.
Pop music, which changes all the time, must influence serious music. That any composer who only shut himself up in his electronics in the sense of gimmicks, now as opposed to electronics in the sense of pop music, of course, that any composer doing that, closing his ears, you see, to the tremendous groundswell of what we know as pop music, will thereby lose an enrichment.
We are not, unfortunately, sometimes blessed with ear laps as we have eyelids. And this is a fact which is mercilessly exploited by our age, and sound, noise, and music which is degrading and cheapening is rammed down our ears without our being able to protest in any way. And I think that is one of the vandalisms of the day.
We are in a perverse and neurotic world on one side of ourselves. And this has to be accepted. But we mustn't imagine that because that is so at the present moment, that is necessarily the key to the future.
This composition was made specially for a large moving sculpture that is in the exhibition hall at Mullard House. And because the sculpture is metallic, I decided that I would not only use electronic sounds, but I would also use metallic ones. Now this puts it in a different class. Tristram Carey has shown you the electronic generators giving these various tone colors. But I have used here also musique concrète. Now, this means going out with the microphone and getting various sounds. Perhaps some people might use even car horns or even tap a milk jug or something like this. But I used large metallic sheets, and I also used some very small sounds, but there are even newer fields opening up. And I'm finding that the computer field interests me greatly.
Daphne Oram is a composer pioneering a completely new way of creating music. About 15 years of thought and a generous grant from the Gulbenkian Foundation have gone into this musical computer. She uses 35mm film to produce the music she calls oramic sound. The method is simple. Paint wavy lines or stick tape on the film, and electronic eyes translate them into notes.
I'm wanting to let the composer completely control things. The machine, I want to do nothing except to translate his requirements. Because I think if we're going to have music out of this machine, that the composer wants to project something of himself. The great works of art are a projection of a human mind. And unless this machine can accept what the composer wants and produce exactly this projection of his thought, then I think it's just a machine, and I can quite see why people can get frightened at the thought of computers and music, computers and any art.
The computer translates its experimental sound into an electronic ballet on the screen of an oscilloscope.
These experiments are quite vital. They're a certain part of it. But they have been, in all my life, addressed only to a small group of interested people, generally very young, who want to try out all sorts of things. There's no doubt that they must go on. There's no doubt in my mind that they are only addressed to quite a small public. If a living composer with great vitality wanting to speak to a larger public, then he has to He has to wrestle with the problem of coming from outside the gimmickry, outside the experiments, to consider what are the deep things he wants to say and how they shall be said by means of a big orchestra or whatever to a larger public.
Britain has always lagged behind the continent as far as artistic development goes, and there's very little official interest in this kind of music. It's not taught and it's not performed by the large concert-giving societies and by the BBC. But on the other hand, there are groups of young composers and performers, and not only people in the musical world, but even more so, I should say, in the scientific and artistic world, who are very interested in this kind of artistic phenomenon. And it's mostly as a pianist that I've been interested in very advanced techniques of playing. The piano that I'm using has got objects placed in its strings which radically change the sound. It is in effect a gigantic percussion instrument under the control of one player. There are many different objects you can insert, new methods of performing, all sorts of different changes you can ring. For instance, you can strike the strings with objects other than a hammer. For instance, this penny. On the lower strings, I've got large bolts inserted, which give a gong-like effect. Further up, there's a screw, and two screws with loose nuts on them, which give percussive rattling effect. And here we have some paper between the strings, which mutes them and produces a dry xylophonic type of effect. Now I have here a piece by a young Welsh composer called Dewey Davies Jones, which looks rather like this. Now, it's called a piano piece, but as you can see, its notation differs considerably from that of conventional piano music, and very few instructions are offered as to how one is going to perform it. Although this piece is very free, it has certain obvious elements. These very large black V-shaped forms and squares are obviously large blocks of sound, and the other thinner lines are normal piano sounds. And when the performance comes to fruition, it'll probably sound something like this.
Anna Lockwood has composed traditional music. Her first violin concerto was performed recently in Cardiff. She also makes music with glass.
I came over from New Zealand in '61 as a composition student at the Royal College of Music for 3 years. I got a year in Germany, commuting between Germany and Holland, looking at electronic music. Electronic music began to sound somewhat similar from one piece to another. Very hard to track down why this was so. I thought maybe our imaginations haven't caught up with what we're using. And I began to notice that if I fiddled around with glass and water and wood, I heard very beautiful, complicated sounds which we spend months in the studio trying to put together and never quite reach.
Her husband and partner, Harvey Matusow.
We still love Beethoven and Bach and Brahms and classics, and the fact that we're doing this doesn't negate that which has existed before. The fact that we find a building that was put up during the Georgian period, the city of Bath is a good example. Do we say now we should tear down all of Bath and put up new architecture because new architecture exists?
Music starts with sound. If the sounds we're starting with are already complicated and beautiful, and as a stone is beautiful when it's split open before a sculptor begins to use it, maybe in laying one sound on top of another densely, we're eliminating half the potential of what we're using.
We take from the old and we accept this, we accept the new, we accept the avant-garde, and we say the same should be true with music and other art forms.
Sounds, there are so many sounds. Traditional music has some sounds, I'm using other sounds. I'm not saying that every sound is beautiful, because it isn't beautiful to me.
An artist has a fantasy, and when that fantasy becomes reality for the world, the artist must leave it and create a new fantasy.
I'm not making it up as I go along. I've chosen which sounds I'm going to use. I've chosen even the sequence. Maybe I shouldn't, but I have.
So where am I going? I'm going into my next fantasy, and I hope to make it a bit of reality, and then move on to another fantasy.
It's a little like going into a gallery of paintings. All the paintings are by the same artist. You move from the first to the last. They're all similar, slightly different. One stops in front of one, has a long look. I let the sounds go on for long enough for everybody to listen.
So I think the future of music is what it always has been, and that is to express some underlying experience of our nature, which is not purely material like art is. It still has to produce a world of sound, but that this relates to all our intimations of things inside ourselves. It's got an enormous question mark over it as to how this is to be done. But there's no doubt in my mind that when I'm safely dead, nevertheless, other people will be there trying, as I have tried, if you like, to make it into durable forms of music.
Karlheinz Stockhausen is the world's most celebrated electronic composer. But he wrote this piece, Giclush, for traditional percussion instruments, a lot of them. John Donaldson is the performer, one of the few in Britain with the necessary musical and gymnastic skill to play it.
The first difficulty one has when faced with the work is sorting out the score, because you can start in any place you like on the 8 pages. It's a spiral bound to begin with, so that you come back to the page you started with. The idea is that you have 9 crescendos during the work, which take place around the circle of instruments, so that wherever the player does start, in actual fact, these sort of crescendos of sound should still be intact. Doesn't matter what happens or what way up you play it or anything else. These should be the same, even if they're reversed. Although it starts off with a feeling of chaos, by the time you've organized your performance and know what you're going to do, it then becomes very exacting. It could be immensely satisfying to yourself once you've worked out your own performance.
Some people, from certain kinds of music, are very odd indeed. Others, they are pure, sheer joy.
It's the past and the understanding and study of the past which has now given the present and the future such enormous vitality.
We are in a perverse and neurotic world, but we mustn't imagine that because that is so at present moment, that is necessarily the key to the future.
I'm going into my next fantasy, and I hope to make it a bit of reality and then move on to another fantasy.